So going back into our sprite sheet folder, you may have noticed that we have several different sprites representing different types of crystals. What we're going to set up is a way for the crystal to randomly choose a sprite to display when it gets instantiated in the scene. In order to do that, though, we're going to have to create a new folder called Resources. Let's create this. And from there, we're going to drag the crystal sprites and the artifact sprites into the resource folder. The resource folder is a special folder inside of Unity that lets the IDE know that these are things that will be loaded at runtime. Now let's make a new script called random sprite. We'll go into our script folder and select new C# script. Let's double click and go back into the editor. We're going to set up two properties: an array for sprites and a string for the resource name. The sprites array will contain all of the sprites that we load up dynamically from the resources folder. The resource name will be the name of the file that we used to pull the texture out of the folder. In start, we want to make sure that the resource name is not set to an empty string. From here, we're going to set up the sprites to equal the resources load all sprite resource name. From here, we're going to access a class called the resources that will load up all of our sprites that are coming from the texture we supply, which will be the resource name. Let's extend this condition out a little bit more. And from here, we want to get a reference to the sprite renderer so that we can manually change the sprite to one of the random sprites that are contained inside of the sprite array. To do this, we'll call getComponent. Here we're going to look for the sprite renderer. And now we're going to set the sprite value to equal sprites random range 0 to sprites length. So from here, what we're going to do is randomly pick a sprite from the sprites array. We'll use the random class and have a range between 0 and the length of the sprite array. Let's save this script and go back into Unity. We can now attach the random sprite script to our crystal. And if we select the crystal in our scene, you'll see here that we have a marker for the sprites, and here we can pull up the resource name. Looking in our resource folder, you'll see that our crystal sprite sheet is named crystals-sprite. Let's type that in here. Now when we hit save and run the game, you should see that the sprite has automatically changed colors. Originally it was purple, now it was silver. If we rerun this again, you should see a different color. Again, we're seeing silver. Remember that it's random, so it may take a few different tries to see different colors. We don't do anything to keep track of what the last random sprite was from the actual other scene that we tested. Now, while this is great, there may come a time when we actually want to manually control what sprite actually shows up first. In order to do that, let's go back into our random sprite class, and we're going to add a property called current sprite. This is going to be an int, and by default, we're going to set this to -1. Current sprite is going to represent an ID in our sprite array that, if this is set, will override the random function. From here, let's go in and make some modifications to where we get our component and modify the sprite renderer sprite. We'll add in a few lines of code above, and now we're going to start testing if the current sprite is actually set to -1. If it is, we're going to set the current sprite to equal random range 0, comma, sprites length, just like we did originally before. Now else, if the current sprite is greater than the sprite's length, we want to make sure that Unity doesn't throw an error. If you try to access an index that's outside of the scope of the array, you can get an error. So in this case, what we want to do is that if the sprite's ID is greater than its length, we want to reset it to its length minus 1. Now, back into where we get our component, since we're already setting this ahead of time, what we can do is change this value to be sprites and paste in here current sprite. We'll hit save and go back into Unity. Let's create a few more of these crystals. You can hit copy and paste and move them around. But instead, let's make sure that we set some of these values to different numbers. So here we're going to set this to 1. We'll set this to 100. And we'll set this one to 2. We're going to leave this one at -1, so it'll always be random. Now, if we run the game, you'll see that we don't get an error. And if we look through each of the crystals, you can see back here in the scene view that this crystal remained at 1. This crystal automatically went to 4. This crystal remained at 2, and this one was randomly selected. Let's stop this, save, and apply our changes back to the crystal's prefab. Now we can quickly create an artifact by following the same steps. Let's go into our resources folder, select one of our artifact sprites, drag it to the scene, and now we can add the 2 components we had before. We'll create a collectible. We'll also go back in and we'll create a new random sprite script on it. And we're going to go and change its name to artifact sprites. Finally, we're going to need to go into Physics 2D, add a box collider, and make it a trigger. We'll hit save, rerun our project, and now you'll see we'll have a randomly changing artifact that we can pick up. We'll stop the game, we'll call this artifact, and turn it into a prefab. At this point, we now have 2 different types of collectibles that we can use within our game. Make sure you save your scene so we can move on.